My boyfriend moved his pregnant friend's family into our tiny apartment. Then, their toddler's fever sent us rushing to the ER. I remember the exact moment Daniel told me that his best friend's house had burned down. We were both studying at our small dining table in our cramped two-bedroom, one-bathroom apartment. Textbooks, notebooks, highlighters, MCAT prep materials on my side, engineering textbooks on his side. Everything was strewn across the table in that familiar, chaotic way two constantly stressed students live. It was late afternoon, though neither of us had seen the sun much that day. We'd been cooped up, alternately typing on our laptops and flipping pages, occasionally getting up to stretch or grab a snack. The smell of coffee still clung to the air, mingling with the faint scent of dinner leftovers we'd eaten an hour before. When the phone rang, Daniel answered, and I watched as his expression changed from mild confusion because Peter, his best friend from high school, rarely called out of the blue, to alarm, then to grim resignation. The words tumbled out of him once he'd ended the call. Peter's home in Southern California was lost in a wildfire that had raged uncontrollably through his neighborhood. Everything seemed to slow down, like the world had pressed pause. These wildfires were all over the news for days, but somehow you never think they'll reach someone you know. You imagine them as distant tragedies, the kind you see on TV, or the kind that spark social media posts about climate change. But now, the reality was colliding with our life. Peter, his pregnant wife Samantha, and their toddler Jake no longer had a house. They were safe, but that safety came with the stark fact that all their possessions, furniture, clothes, even sentimental items were gone. It was crushing to think about. Daniel and I sat there for a moment, letting the news sink in, and my mind started spiraling with questions. Where will they go? What do they need right now? Do they have a place to stay tonight? Daniel, being who he is, a compassionate, sometimes impulsive helper, immediately began brainstorming ways to assist them. I too wanted to help, but I felt overwhelmed with the practicalities. We were in Northern California. Both of us broke college students whose rent in this expensive region hovered near $3,000 a month. I was double-checking my mental budget. I had some savings I could contribute. Maybe we could buy them groceries or clothes, or wire them some emergency money. 100 thoughts collided at once. I pictured pulling out my phone, contacting everyone I knew in SoCal. Maybe one of my friends could let them crash for a while. Maybe they could go to a shelter for displaced families. As these ideas formed, Daniel nodded, telling me he'd already arranged to wire them a little money for immediate needs. Then, out of the blue, he said, I'll call them in the morning. Maybe we can help them find a place. I gave him a relieved smile. That sounded reasonable. We could surely do that and not push ourselves beyond what we could handle. But the next day, I was up early, half-dressed in my usual sweatpants and hoodie, sipping a too-hot mug of coffee, when I overheard Daniel on FaceTime. The only words I caught at first were, yes, absolutely. You guys can stay here. My heart sank, and I froze where I stood. I felt a tightness in my lungs that I recognized as the onset of anxiety, the rapid swirl of fearful thoughts. Our tiny second bedroom was actually a cramped office with a cheap desk from IKEA, a tall bookshelf filled to capacity, and barely any floor space. Even calling it a second bedroom was a generous stretch. We had one bathroom. We lived in a complex that was already noisy, older, with thin walls. I had no idea how we'd accommodate a toddler, a pregnant woman, and Peter for any length of time, especially with my MCAT date in January looming ever closer. My stress level was already through the roof just imagining the invasion of noise, the disruption, the feelings of tension in a place that was our sole refuge. Daniel concluded the FaceTime call with a bright, "Sure thing, man. No, really, stay as long as you need." Then he set his phone down and turned to me. Before he could open his mouth, I asked, "What did you just do?" I remember the way my voice sounded. Trembling, higher than usual, because I was already on the edge of panic. Daniel looked at me with genuine confusion, as if he honestly hadn't expected me to react negative. "They lost everything," he said. "They need a place. We have a roof." I figured we'd want to help. As he spoke, I felt the tension coil inside my chest. My emotions wanted to erupt. Instead, I tried to explain calmly, though my voice shook, that we were living on a shoestring budget, that we didn't have the space, and that having a toddler around 24/7 while I was preparing for the single most important exam of my life was a recipe for disaster. He frowned, looking slightly hurt, maybe disappointed in me for not instantly agreeing. "But they're basically family," he argued. "Peter's like a brother to me. I really thought you'd be on board." The conversation went back and forth, swiftly turning into an argument. I voiced all the concerns that were swirling in my head, how it would be extremely loud and stressful, how the second bedroom was no more than a glorified closet, how the single bathroom would be used by 5 people if you counted the toddler. Then there was the question of finances. No matter how much we wanted to help, We couldn't cover another set of groceries, utilities, and everything else for a family of 3 without sacrificing our own well-being. He insisted we'd figure it out, that maybe Peter would chip in, or we could float them for a while until they got back on their feet. His eyes were filled with an earnest sense of moral duty, and I felt torn between my desire to be compassionate and the rational part of my brain screaming that this would be a terrible plan. Finally, Daniel apologized if he had overstepped and admitted he should have asked me first. But he stood firm on his decision. I already told them yes, and they're arriving tomorrow, he said softly, a near pleading look on his face. I can't take it back now. I just stared at him, speechless. A numbness spread through me as I realized we were now stuck with this arrangement, because I couldn't imagine telling a friend who'd lost his home in a fire. Actually, never mind. Please stay somewhere else. I ended up going out for a walk, needing air. A swirl of guilt and resentment hammered at me. I recognized that, yes, it was an extraordinary situation and they'd just lost their home, but I wished we could have at least discussed it. I needed to prepare, psychologically and physically, for what hosting them would entail. I felt cornered and upset. At the same time, I felt guilty about feeling cornered. It was a haze of contradictory emotions. Later that evening, I came back and found Daniel making up a mattress on the floor of the office. He had dragged our seldom-used twin mattress from a closet and was trying to make it look cozy. Seeing that small space, which was already lined with boxes and a cheap dresser, made me choke up with fresh anxiety. I literally broke down into sobs and Daniel rushed over to hold me. "We're doing the right thing," he murmured, trying to reassure. "They have no place else to go." But part of me questioned that. Maybe they did have other options. Other relatives or wealthier friends. I knew from conversations over the years that Peter had a wealthy extended family, though apparently relations were tense. Still, it felt so extreme to invite them into our home without exploring alternatives first. That night, I slept fitfully, waking up with my heart pounding every couple hours, dreading the next day and the unknown chaos it might bring. The next day was supposed to be an ordinary Thursday for us. Classes, work shifts, a lab for me, a project meeting for Daniel. But now it was overshadowed by the knowledge that Peter, Samantha, and their toddler Jake could arrive at any time. Daniel bought groceries, focusing on items that could accommodate a toddler: applesauce, cereal, small crackers, some fruit pouches. I tried to do a quick vacuum and dust, then found myself just pacing around the apartment, checking my phone, half hoping they would cancel or come a different day. It felt surreal that so much of our carefully balanced routine was about to be thrown into turmoil. By around 3 in the afternoon, Daniel got a text from Peter. They were running late because Jake was feeling ill and had vomited at a rest stop. My stomach lurched when I heard that. A sick toddler in our home? With only one bathroom? My mind spiraled to worst-case scenarios. A child with a fever, constant crying, piles of laundry, the smell of vomit. I tried to tell myself not to be heartless. I was worried about Jake. He was an innocent kid after all, caught in this nightmare scenario. But the anxiety still clawed at me. Daniel's face reflected concern as well, but I could see he was determined to power through. "They should be here before 10, he said at one point, reading another text from Peter. "They're just driving slow because of Jake." Sure enough, close to 9:30 that night, I heard a car pull up outside. Daniel and I both headed downstairs to the park. The night air was cool. I felt goosebumps on my arms. As we approached the car, we saw Peter climb out of the driver's seat, looking exhausted. Samantha, heavily pregnant, opened the passenger door, her expression pale and drawn. "Hey guys," Peter said with a weak, weary smile. "Sorry for the late arrival. It's been rough." We murmured our sympathies, asked if Jake was all right. Samantha mumbled that he'd been throwing up on and off for hours. She just sounded drained. I could see into the back seat where little Jake, red-faced and half asleep, lay slumped in the car seat. I hadn't anticipated how much luggage they would have. Despite losing their home, they had 2 large suitcases, a duffel bag, and several reusable grocery bags stuffed with random items. Some clothes, some unopened food, some half-eaten snacks, phone chargers, a tangle of random personal belongings. My eyes flicked from the massive load to the flight of stairs leading up to our apartment. Daniel and Peter exchanged a resigned look, but they started hauling everything up. Samantha wobbled, clinging to the railing, so I put an arm under hers to help her. My anxiety flared again as I thought about how that second bedroom would store all this stuff plus accommodate them. But what could I do now? When we finally got up to the apartment, Samantha sank onto our couch in the living room, looking like she might pass out from exhaustion. At that moment, she abruptly said, "Oh, Jake's still in the car. Can one of you get him?" I blinked in confusion. She had walked all the way up and completely forgotten to unbuckle her son? I tried to hide my astonishment and said, "Sure, I'll go." My chest tightened with dread when I realized I'd be the one removing him from his seat, dealing with any new vomit. I forced myself to remain calm and remind myself that the poor kid was in a miserable situation. Sure enough, when I opened the back door of the car, Jake was strapped in, whimpering soft. Beside his seat were two plastic bags tied shut, presumably full of vomit. The stench made me gag. As gently as I could, I unbuckled him, trying to ignore the sticky residue near his chin and on his clothes. He felt alarmingly warm in my arms. His cheeks flushed. I grabbed the bags of vomit so they wouldn't just sit there to rot, tossed them in the dumpster near our building, and then carried Jake upstairs. The entire time he clung to me, his eyes half-lidded, occasionally letting out a whimper that tugged at my heartstrings. Here I was, resentful of the intrusion, but also profoundly sorry for a little boy who had no idea why life was suddenly so chaotic. Inside, Samantha had inched herself off the couch and begun rummaging through one of the bags, while Daniel and Peter were still moving luggage. Jake took a few unsteady steps, and then the worst happened. He started to retch. Samantha yelled, "Again? Are you kidding me, Jake?" before he threw up all over our carpet. I felt my stomach twist. Vomit splattered, the acrid odor filling the living area. My eyes darted to Samantha, who was trying to mop it up with a single napkin, but she was basically grinding it deeper into the fibers. Jake started to cry, a pitiful, keening wail. Samantha snapped, "Shut up!" then immediately softened her voice, as though she realized how harsh she sounded. The tension in the room soared. I wanted to cry right there. I dashed to the kitchen to get paper towels and cleaning spray. By the time I came back, Samantha was still smearing the stain around. Jake stood there, tears and mucus running down his face, red from fever or crying or both. She pointed at me with the soiled napkin. "Can you get him cleaned up, please? I need to take care of this mess." All I could do was nod, because the one thing that mattered most in that moment was that Jake looked genuinely ill. I worried about dehydration, about a fever spiking. My MCAT prep flashed through my mind. I knew the basics of pediatric fevers, how quickly they can escalate. I took him into our small bathroom, stripped off his stained clothes, and started running warm water in the tub. We had a digital thermometer in the medicine cabinet, so I grabbed it, dried it off, and slipped it under his tongue as gently as possible. He whimpered, but I managed to keep it there long enough. When I read the number, 106 degrees Fahrenheit, I felt my chest tighten with alarm. "Oh my God," I whispered. That was dangerously high. My mind immediately began scanning potential causes. Severe food poisoning or something more sinister like meningitis. Then I remembered that Samantha and Peter were not big on vaccinations. The last time Daniel and I visited them, they casually mentioned they didn't believe in putting chemicals in Jake's body, so they'd never followed up on standard immunizations. I yelled for Samantha. When she finally trudged into the bathroom looking exasperated, I asked her what Jake had eaten and explained that 106 was extremely high. She shrugged, saying, "Just fruit and maybe some crackers the past couple days, I don't know." She seemed more annoyed than worried, but I suspected she was also exhausted and not thinking clearly. I pressed on. "Has Jake been vaccinated for meningitis?" She shook her head. We haven't done any shots." The dread in my stomach deepened. A high fever, vomiting, rapid breathing, and headache or neck stiffness could be signs of meningococcal meningitis, which can turn life-threatening fast. I bent down next to Jake, trying to coax him. "Does your head hurt, buddy? Can you move your neck?" He just cried and clutched his head, as though even small movements pained him. Panic started to race through me. I called for Daniel and Peter, explained the situation. "Guys, I'm not a doctor yet, obviously, but 106 plus no vaccines is dangerous. We need to get him to the ER. Meningitis can kill kids if not treated immediately." Samantha's eyes widened. Her face seemed to drain of color. Peter looked horrified, glancing helplessly at Daniel. "Let's go," Daniel said without hesitation. So we bundled Jake up in a towel and rushed out, ignoring the fact that it was nearly midnight. I ended up in the back seat with Jake again, trying to keep him awake, checking him for rashes with the flashlight on my phone. Samantha sobbed quietly, apologizing to Jake, to the universe, to no one in particular. Peter was twisting around in the passenger seat, watching me hold Jake with stricken eyes. Daniel drove like a madman, weaving through nearly empty streets, running more than one yellow light. It felt surreal, like a dream sequence. Our entire living situation had been upended in a matter of minutes. The ER triage desk ushered us in immediately when we said we suspected meningitis in a 2-year-old with a 106-degree fever, unvaccinated. They took Jake in, asked who the mother was, and Samantha, tears streaking her face, followed them down the hallway. The nurse also let Peter through. Daniel and I stayed behind in the waiting area, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The entire place smelled like antiseptic and a faint undertone of sickness. I collapsed into a plastic chair, my hands shaking, and Daniel sat beside me, rubbing my back. I felt tears well up in my eyes. The stress of the last 12 hours, The meltdown I was bracing for with them coming to stay, and now this medical emergency. It was too much. I cried quietly, and Daniel kept apologizing over and over. I'm so sorry. This is all my fault. That statement made me both love him for caring so much and resent him for not thinking things through. After about 45 minutes, Peter emerged, telling us they'd started Jake on broad-spectrum antibiotics while they waited for blood tests and a spinal tap to confirm meningitis. Samantha was in there, crying, but Jake was stable at the moment. He's in good hands, Peter kept saying, like he was reassuring himself. Daniel told him to go back in, be with his kid, and that we'd wait to hear updates. Part of me wanted to stay all night. But exhaustion was hitting me like a ton of bricks. And eventually, Daniel insisted that I go home. You can't do anything more right now, he said, gently stroking my hair. Go sleep. I'll handle it. I felt a wave of relief and guilt. Guilt, because I was leaving a critically ill child behind, even though he wasn't my child. Relief, because I so badly wanted my bed, my pillow, just a moment of quiet. So I left in an Uber, my eyes heavy, tears still clinging to my lashes. I vaguely remembered stepping into our apartment, noticing the half-cleaned carpet and the scattered luggage. I brushed my teeth in a daze and stumbled into bed, where I crashed into the deepest sleep I'd had in weeks. When morning came, I woke around 10, bleary-eyed, with a headache pounding at my temples. The apartment was silent, eerily so. I stepped out into the living room to find Daniel asleep on the couch in yesterday's clothes. The suitcases, the duffel bag, and the scattered grocery bags were all gone. The second bedroom door stood open. The old twin mattress was leaning against the wall again, and the entire place felt strangely empty. My stomach flipped with confusion. Had Samantha and Peter left? I shook Daniel awake gently. He blinked up at me, dark circles under his eyes, and rubbed his face. They're gone, he murmured. Well, not exactly gone. They're at a hotel near the hospital. I paid for a week up front, with a discount. Jake's in the ICU, but he's stable. Once they put him on antibiotics, his vitals started improving. I spent half the night calling hotels till I found one that was willing to discount a room when I explained the emergency. He paused, then took a shaky breath. I helped Peter move their stuff from here to the hotel. He said it was okay, that he understood. He'd rather be closer to the hospital anyway. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel looked up, tears shining in his eyes, and whispered, I'm so sorry. I didn't think this through. I just reacted. I never wanted to put you through that. Everything happened so fast, and I just realized how impossible it would be for them to stay here, especially with Jake's help. I leaned down and hugged him. I'm not mad. I just wish you'd asked me first. But let's be thankful Jake is in the ICU and getting what he needs. That's the priority. In the following days, we both tried to return to normal, though it was hard to wipe away the memory of the chaos. Jake's diagnosis turned out to be bacterial meningitis, but the doctors were hopeful that he'd make a full recovery, especially since they'd gotten him on antibiotics fairly quickly. Peter and Samantha were beyond stressed. They were living day to day in the hotel, spending most of their time at the hospital, waiting for new test results, talking to specialists, scrambling to figure out their future. Daniel and I visited once, just briefly, to drop off some essentials we'd gathered. Extra clothes, more groceries, toiletries. Samantha apologized in a subdued voice for the meltdown at our apartment. She admitted she'd been overwhelmed and exhausted. She looked worn, with heavy bags under her eyes, one hand always protectively on her swollen belly. I felt a strange mixture of sympathy and lingering wariness, recalling how she'd yelled at Jake to shut up and how she had gone out partying during our visits. But at that moment, I tried to set aside judgments. We all do and say things we regret when we're under extreme stress, and their entire world had literally burned to ashes. Meanwhile, I wrestled with a swirl of emotions. Guilt that I'd been relieved they weren't staying, compassion for their tragedy, anger at how it all happened, and fear for Jake's life. Sleep came fitfully. I often had nightmares about searching for a lost child in a burning building. Daniel was also quiet, brooding in a way that wasn't like him. One night, about a week after this all started, we had a long talk. He admitted that he'd felt a powerful sense of obligation to help Peter, like repaying a debt from their childhood. Peter had stood up for him in high school when Daniel was bullied, and they'd been inseparable ever since. Daniel said, I just never thought about the logistics, about our space, our finances, your MCAT, none of it. I just thought I owed him. I reached out and took his hand, telling him I understood. It was a noble impulse, but next time we had to plan together. We managed to set up a small crowdfunding campaign for Peter's family, sharing the story with some of our friends, hoping they could pitch in for a little financial relief. We also called a few organizations that help families displaced by disasters, passing along the phone numbers to Peter. He thanked us profusely in texts, updating us with pictures of Jake's hospital. Jake was stable, but spent over a week in the ICU. Antibiotics fought off the infection, and once his fever finally broke, the hospital moved him out of intensive care. Daniel and I visited him after that, bringing a stuffed dinosaur that Daniel picked out. Jake still looked tired, but the sparkle was returning to his eyes. When Samantha offered a shaky smile, I felt some hope that their family would recover from this, even if they had a rocky path ahead. Eventually, Peter's wealthy relatives from about 200 miles away got back in contact. Relations had been strained, but the crisis forced them to put aside whatever drama existed. They offered to fund an apartment for a few months, at least until Peter found a job and they had some stability. In a sense, it was a relief for everyone, because that meant Peter and Samantha wouldn't have to be entirely on our shoulders or anyone else's. Once Jake was discharged from the hospital, they planned to move into the new place. We offered to help with packing or to forward them more groceries, but Daniel and I both knew we were at capacity. We needed to focus on our studies, on paying our rent, on holding on to our own fragile sense of stability. One evening, as Daniel and I were tidying up the apartment, finally dealing with the last traces of that night, a faint stain on the carpet that needed another round of cleaning solution, Daniel looked at me with a rueful expression. You know, I guess in a twisted way, I'm glad they came here, if only because we ended up realizing Jake was in serious danger. Maybe if they'd gone somewhere else, it would have been a slower realization. Maybe we wouldn't have caught it in time. He was wrestling with a complicated kind of guilt-laced relief. I nodded. Part of me shuddered to imagine what could have happened if they had just shrugged off Jake's fever as a bad case of food poisoning. The memory of him in the bathroom, his cheeks blazing, flopped against the tub, still haunts me sometimes. But at least we got him where he needed to be. Over the next month, we stayed in regular contact with Peter and Samantha, offering them moral support and small financial contributions whenever we could. Samantha's second pregnancy continued, with more checkups. She looked apologetic and reserved whenever we FaceTime. I suspected she felt a degree of shame over how the entire ordeal had unfolded, maybe even how she'd treated Jake. She didn't curse at him on camera anymore. She actually asked me for tips on controlling morning sickness one morning, which felt surreal, because I'm not a mom, but I had researched a lot about general healthcare topics for the MCAT. I told her the standard: ginger, crackers, small frequent meals, hydration. She thanked me quietly, stroking her belly. In the end, they moved into a modest apartment funded by Peter's relatives. Jake slowly regained his energy, though the hospital recommended physical therapy for a few weeks to ensure there were no long-lasting effects from the meningitis. Daniel and I never had them back in our place again. Not to be cruel, but it wasn't necessary, and we had to maintain boundaries for our own sanity. Instead, we helped them from a distance. I still had moments of guilt about being so wary and resentful in the beginning, but I had to accept that boundaries are important, and it's not wrong to acknowledge your own limits. If a person tries to rescue someone else without regard for their own capacity, it can lead to an even worse collapse for both parties. One night, about 2 months later, I was sitting at my desk finishing some MCAT flashcards when Daniel came in and said, "You know, I think we did the best we could." He was reading my face, trying to gauge if I still felt unsettled about everything. And in that moment, I realized I felt a strange sense of peace. We had messed up in our communication. He had acted impulsively, and I had reacted with anger. But we had also saved a life, or at least helped ensure Jake got immediate care. There was room in that reality for both the relief and the regret. By the time I finally took the MCAT in January, I was a bundle of nerves, but I also felt a renewed purpose. Partly because the experience with Jake made me see, up close, the delicate line between life-threatening illness and recovery. Studying about bacterial infections, the immune system, the importance of vaccines, and the signs of meningitis had become startlingly vivid after living it for real. When I reached certain sections of the exam, I drew on both my academic preparation and the emotional memory of that night. The fear, the rush to the hospital, my trembling hands checking him for rashes. It made me more determined in some odd way to pursue medicine as a field where I could help prevent tragedies like that or at least mitigate them. Meanwhile, Daniel threw himself into his engineering projects, though I noticed he also spent time volunteering for a local group that helped displaced families, maybe as a way to channel his compassion more safely than spontaneously inviting entire families to move in. He'd come home and tell me about the heartbreak stories of those who'd lost their homes to natural disasters, reminding me that Peter's family wasn't alone. Wildfires weren't going away anytime soon, and so many families each year ended up in shelters or couch surfing for months, their lives uprooted by flames. As the months continued, we learned that Peter's father and uncles helped him secure a used car. Their previous one had some issues. And Samantha gave birth to a baby girl. We heard that the baby was healthy, which was a relief, given the stress Samantha had been under. I quietly hoped that Samantha had curbed her partying and would focus on the health of her children. We never delved too deep into that. It felt invasive and judgmental to keep bringing up her choices. We were just relieved that the baby was all right, that Jake was recovered, and that maybe Peter and Samantha would use this opportunity to build a more stable life. Whether that would happen, only time would tell. Daniel stayed in frequent contact with Peter, swapping text messages, funny memes, and the occasional phone call. Peter seemed grateful, always saying things like, "We owe you guys so much," and it made me feel uneasy. I didn't want them to feel indebted. I just wanted them to be safe, healthy, and hopefully more responsible for their own children. That's one thing I learned. Helping people in crisis is complicated. It's not always as simple as open your doors and house them. Sometimes the best help you can give is financial support, organizational resources, or emotional backing. Sometimes giving up your personal space can lead to a meltdown for everyone involved, especially if you have a small space, limited finances, and tremendous obligations, like me and my MCAT. Compassion can exist hand in hand with boundaries. It's a lesson I'll carry forward in life. Occasionally, I still felt the dull echo of that initial resentment, especially remembering how quickly Daniel had made that decision. But each time, I reminded myself how it all ended up. Jake got medical care just in time, and we found them a safe place to stay. If that had been delayed, who knows what might have happened. Meningitis is no joke, especially in a toddler who hasn't been vaccinated. We might have literally saved his life by recognizing the signs that night. Over time, the frantic energy of that episode faded. Daniel and I went back to juggling classes, studying for exams, working our part-time jobs. We even managed occasional date nights at a cheap eatery near campus or at the local arcade, though we were both mindful of finances. Sometimes we'd reminisce about the chaos. Me running around in pajamas, trying to clean vomit from the carpet, Samantha cursing at Jake while nearly collapsing with exhaustion, Daniel driving like a man possessed to the ER. It felt surreal, like an overly dramatic scene from a TV show. Yet it had all been real, a potent reminder that life can upend itself in the blink of an eye. About 2 or 3 months after the crisis, I remember drifting off to sleep in Daniel's arms, feeling more secure in our relationship than ever before. We'd come out the other side of a crisis that tested not only our capacity for empathy, but also our boundaries and our willingness to communicate. We argued, we cried, we nearly fell apart. But in the end, we discovered we could survive a major storm together. That gave me a sense of confidence in our partnership that I'd never had before. I fell asleep that night picturing Jake's tiny face, imagining him healthy, hopefully exploring a new yard somewhere, free of fevers or vomiting. And I pictured that new baby girl who deserved the best possible chance at a stable life. Sometimes I think about whether I could have done more or done something differently. Could I have approached the situation less selfishly? Should I have swallowed my anxiety and wholeheartedly embraced them into our home from day one? But then I realized that scenario could have been worse for everyone, including Jake, if we hadn't taken him to the ER right away. Perhaps if they had settled in with us, we might have all gone to bed trying to wait it out until morning, and that delay might have been catastrophic. So in a strange way, the meltdown, Jake throwing up in our living room, me checking his fever, set in motion the urgent trip to the hospital that almost certainly saved him from complications. You can never predict how these events will unfold. Peter did confirm later that the official cause of the fire was a massive wildfire that swept their entire neighborhood, and their home was burned practically to the ground. They had lost nearly all their possessions. It's harrowing to imagine. They did salvage a few personal keepsakes because Samantha had insisted on taking certain valuables with them when they evacuated. But that was it. Insurance was a mess, of course, and would take months if not years to resolve. The entire region would be rebuilding. Samantha said her father lost a storage unit that also had some of her old things in it. It was a total nightmare for them financially. It reminded me of how close to the edge so many of us live, how one disaster can wipe out everything. When they finally settled into that new apartment, somewhere about an hour's drive from the hospital, Daniel and I sent them some housewarming items. A small coffee table, a set of sheets, a couple of pillows, courtesy of some gift cards we'd pooled from friends. Peter texted Daniel a picture of the living room. It looked modest but safe. Jake was perched on a toy car. Samantha was off to the side, looking somewhat tired but content, resting a hand on her belly, which was still quite large at that point. They seemed to be forging ahead, battered but not broken. As for me, I gained a sharper sense of perspective on how I want to help people as a future physician. The drama of that night, the fear in Samantha's eyes and the trembling in Peter's voice, those details made me realize how desperately people need compassionate, informed assistance in a crisis. I'm more determined than ever to make it into med school and become the kind of doctor who can handle medical emergencies calmly, guiding families through the worst moments. But I also learned I have to respect my own limitations and mental health. I can't simply fling the doors of my life wide open and overshadow my ability to function. There's a balance. Boundaries matter. Gradually, I stopped getting nightmares of that night. Studying for the MCAT consumed me, forcing me to funnel my anxious energy into repeated practice questions. Daniel busied himself with his senior capstone project. We'd occasionally debrief about that bizarre experience, marveling at how quickly life can turn from ordinary to chaotic. Sometimes I'd still read about meningitis or toddler fevers in my prep books and shudder at the memory of the thermometer reading 106. Each time Daniel would rub my back and remind me that Jake was okay now. It almost felt like a different lifetime. Weeks after Jake was discharged and they'd moved, Daniel received a photo of Jake in a playful dinosaur costume. He wanted to say hi, Peter wrote. Jake had the biggest grin, the kind kids wear when they have no memory of being near death. Samantha was in the background of the picture, giving a small smile. I felt an odd ache in my chest at how fragile life is, how close they'd come to tragedy, but how kids can bounce back with astounding resilience. If anything, that photo was the highlight of a day otherwise filled with mundane stress over upcoming finals and my looming MCAT test date. Eventually, Samantha gave birth to her baby girl. They named her Lily. We only saw pictures, tiny newborn fists, a tuft of dark hair, and the text message from Peter read that Lily was healthy. He said Samantha was trying to cut back on partying, which was a relief. He didn't detail exactly how or whether she was seeking any help, but at least the baby arrived with no apparent complications. I wondered quietly if Lily was vaccinated or if they'd carry that same resistance they had before. Part of me was tempted to bring it up, to push them to see how dangerous it was not to vaccinate, but ultimately, I held my tongue. People rarely respond well to lectures in the midst of personal upheaval, and Daniel warned me that we'd probably just push them away. Maybe their scare with Jake changed their minds. Maybe not. But it was out of my hands. As time passed, we moved on to the next phase of our lives, focusing on final exams, then the break, then a new semester. I took the MCAT, feeling as prepared as one can be for that beast of a test. Meanwhile, Daniel accepted an internship. We were both physically and mentally exhausted most days. But late at night, when we'd curl up on our sagging couch, we sometimes reminisced about how everything could have gone differently. If Daniel and I had better communication from the start, we might have found them a hotel immediately instead of bringing them here. If I had been less anxious, maybe I wouldn't have felt so guilty or resentful, or maybe the meltdown would have felt less traumatic. Yet no matter how we replayed it, we landed on the same conclusion. We were just two stressed college kids trying to do our best in a whirlwind. Mistakes were made, but also good things happened. Ultimately, Jake got the medical care he needed in time. One particular night, Daniel was scrolling through social media and found photos that Peter's relatives had posted of a charity event for fire victims. He showed me pictures of families who had lost everything, some still living in shelters or in cramped trailer homes. He murmured, "It's so easy to forget this is still happening for so many people." I looked at the pictures of children in borrowed clothes, forced smiles on their faces. My heart clenched at how many times disasters ruin lives. And though we had struggled with the idea of hosting, we'd at least tried to help in some capacity. It made me reflect on the complexity of compassion, how moral obligations and empathy can clash with reality. But I also felt a surge of gratitude that we were safe, that we could keep our heads above water. In a world that can destroy a home overnight, that's no small thing. At one point, I remember I posted anonymously on Reddit, sharing the broad strokes of the story, omitting names and some details, and asking for advice. The responses were a mixed bag. Some people called me heartless for not welcoming them unconditionally. Others said I had done enough by offering financial support, that I shouldn't risk my mental health or my future. In the end, though, many recognized that the situation was complicated. That provided a bit of catharsis. I learned I wasn't alone in feeling that push and pull of wanting to help, but also protect my own life. And ironically, once the full story came out, how we ended up rushing Jake to the ER, him having meningitis, how they ended up moving to a hotel, people saw the bigger picture. That sometimes, even the best intentions can lead to frantic, near-catastrophic scenarios if not handled with caution. We ended up with relief that Jake was alive, relief that we preserved our sanity, and relief that no permanent damage was done to any relationships. Maybe a little scarring, but no permanent damage. By the end of that semester, Daniel and I had grown closer. We found new respect for each other's strengths. He admired my ability to stay calm under medical pressure, noticing how I quickly recognized the risk of meningitis. I admired his big heart, how he jumped into action to help them, and then how he spent hours in the dead of night finding a hotel near the hospital. We both realized that if we were ever faced with a crisis again, maybe not the same, but something else, we'd need to talk and plan before making major decisions. That was our biggest takeaway. Communication is everything, especially when it involves something as life-altering as hosting a family. Eventually, Peter and Samantha's second child was a few months old. Jake was back to normal, and they were still staying in that apartment while insurance and other financial details got sorted out. They had begun talking about a fresh start, maybe returning to community college or finding better-paying jobs. I hoped they would. Every so often, Samantha would pop up in a group chat with me and a few other people, sounding more grounded than before. I like to imagine that almost losing Jake was the wake-up call they needed to become more responsible parents. People can change, though sometimes it takes a brush with tragedy. Time marched on. Daniel and I were able to pay our rent and keep up with our classes, though we definitely felt the pinch. Those weeks of crisis had us dipping into our savings to help them, plus Daniel had paid for the hotel for a full week. But we never regretted that part. It still felt like the right thing to do, overshadowed only by how stressful it was to discover Jake's illness in our living room. Sometimes if I closed my eyes, I could still picture him standing there with tears in his feverish eyes, Samantha smearing vomit across the carpet, me rushing to get a thermometer. It would always remain one of the most surreal nights of my life. Looking back, I have no illusions that we handled everything perfectly, but life is messy. And in a crisis, you do what you can with the emotional and financial resources you have. Compassion is beautiful, but it's also not limitless. We're only human, with our own stressors and boundaries. Some might argue that we should have opened our doors to them indefinitely, that love means total sacrifice. Others might say we never should have let them walk through the door at all, given the obvious complications. The truth is somewhere in between, as it often is. We tried to help, but discovered we had to do so in a way that didn't plunge us all into deeper chaos. That's not selfish. That's survival. And ironically, it probably was safer for Jake to be near the hospital rather than in our cramped apartment. Months slipped by, and the memory of that chaotic night still remained a reminder of how quickly everything can shift. Whenever Daniel's phone lit up with a text from Peter, I'd brace myself for news, good or bad. But gradually, the texts became more mundane. Pictures of Jake at a park, or Lily smiling in a stroller. Occasionally, we'd get updates about how Samantha was trying to be a better mom, or how Peter was applying for jobs. It was normal life stuff, the quiet rebuilding after a disaster. We didn't see them in person for a long time because of distance, finances, and simply being busy with school and part-time work. But at least we knew they were safe. In the end, I realized the entire ordeal had a kind of logical conclusion for us. We helped them, but we didn't become their doormat. We discovered that empathy has to be balanced with practicality, that boundaries protect not only us but also those we're helping. Had they stayed with us, the stress, arguments, and financial strain might have boiled over, hurting everyone involved. Instead, with a hotel near the hospital and the eventual support of Peter's relatives, they found a better living arrangement. Jake received urgent medical care, and Samantha got the time and space to rest through the last trimester of her pregnancy without the chaos of our small apartment. It wasn't the path Daniel initially intended, but it was the one that worked, and we all emerged a little wiser and a little more aware of how fragile normalcy can be. Sometimes I think about the irony that the best thing we did for them, beyond that first wave of compassion, was recognizing how unsustainable it would be to have them in our apartment. It forced Daniel to scramble to find a hotel close to the hospital, which was exactly what they needed. The alternative might have risked Jake's condition worsening while we tried to figure things out. That alone justified our decision in my mind, and I remember the deep relief I felt waking up that morning after the ER visit, seeing that they'd left for the hotel. It was a complicated relief, tinged with guilt but also a sense of protecting ourselves. I think it's okay to hold both compassion and relief. That's what being human often entails. Contradictory emotions that somehow coexist. Our story ends with Jake healthy, Lily born safely, Daniel and I still together, supporting each other through the tail end of college. Peter and Samantha remain in the periphery of our lives, grateful and hopefully forging a better future for their children. At times, I'd reflect on how close we came to living in a crowded apartment with a pregnant woman and a toddler in meltdown mode. But it never came to that, or at least not for more than a few hours. Instead, we got a lesson in balancing empathy and practicality, a front row seat to a frightening medical emergency, and a reaffirmation that we truly do care about these people, even if we prefer to do so from the stable ground of our own carefully preserved boundaries. It was one of the most stressful experiences of my life, but looking back, I can say I'm grateful for how it ultimately played out. For all of us. Jake is safe. They have a roof over their heads. And Daniel and I have a stronger bond and a deeper understanding of the complexities of helping loved ones in crisis. Sometimes, that's the best outcome anyone can hope